The fluorescent lights of the Value Mart hummed a merciless, buzzing tune over Alex Davies's head. It was a sound he'd come to associate with failure. He stood at the checkout, a flimsy plastic basket in his hand containing the barest essentials. A loaf of bread, a carton of milk, a small block of cheese, and a jar of peanut butter. The final item, a small chocolate cake with cheerful pink frosting roses, felt like a foolish extravagance, a desperate attempt to manufacture joy for his daughter Lily's 6th birthday tomorrow. He slid the items onto the conveyor belt, his movements stiff with a weary shame he knew all too well. The cashier, a teenager with bored eyes and a name tag that read Brittany, scanned them with robotic indifference. The total flashed on the screen, $2,314. Alex's heart hammered against his ribs. He had $24 in his account. Just enough. He slid his debit card into the chip reader, holding his breath as the machine processed the transaction. A harsh, grating beep cut through the store's low murmur. Declined, the word blazed in red digital letters. A public condemnation. Brittany sighed, a gust of bubblegum-scented impatience. "It didn't go through," she said, her voice flat. "Do you have another card?" Alex's face burned. He could feel the eyes of the people in line behind him, their collective annoyance a physical weight on his shoulders. "No," he mumbled, his throat tight. Just run it again. Please." He knew it was pointless, a futile prayer to a digital god that had already passed judgment, but he had to try. She rolled her eyes and jabbed a button. Again, the same cruel beep, the same red letters. His humiliation was now complete. "Look, I've got a line," Brittany snapped. "You gotta take something off." The man behind him, heavy-set and impatient, shifted his weight, his grocery cart nudging Alex's leg. "Come on, buddy," he grumbled. Alex's hands trembled as he reached for the small chocolate cake. Lily's face, bright with anticipation, flashed in his mind. He had promised her a party, a tiny one, just the two of them, with a cake and a candle to wish on. The pink frosting seemed to mock him. He placed it on the divider for returned items, the plastic dome a tiny tomb for a dead promise. His chest ached. "Try it now," he whispered, his voice cracking. The total was now $1,578. He swiped the card again. This time, a pleasant chime signaled its approval. As he fumbled to bag his meager purchases, a smooth, condescending voice cut through his shame. "Having a little trouble, Davies?" Alex froze. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Marcus Henderson, his landlord. A man who wore his wealth like a suit of armor and wielded his contempt like a sword. Henderson was standing 2 people back in line, a bottle of expensive wine and a wedge of imported cheese in his basket. He smirked, his gaze flicking from Alex's sparse groceries to the rejected birthday cake. "Best to live within your means," Henderson said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Saves everyone a lot of embarrassment." A few people snickered. Alex felt the heat rise to his ears, a helpless, suffocating rage mixing with his despair. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He grabbed his bag, the plastic handles digging into his fingers, and walked away, Henderson's smug laughter following him out into the cold parking lot. When he arrived at his small, rented bungalow, the final blow was waiting for him. Taped to the front door, the bright orange paper fluttered in the evening breeze. An official eviction notice. He had 72 hours to vacate the premises. He sank onto the front step, the bag of groceries forgotten at his feet, and stared at the paper, the legal jargon blurring into a single, crushing word: homeless. The next morning, Alex sat in Marcus Henderson's sterile, minimalist office. The air was cold, scented with lemon polish and money. Henderson leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, steepling his fingers, an expression of bored tolerance on his face. He looked every bit the predator, sleek and patient, waiting for his prey to exhaust itself. Alex had spent the night rehearsing this speech, piecing together words of supplication and reason, but now they felt like ash in his mouth. "Mr. Henderson," he began, his voice hoarse. I just need a little more time. A week, maybe 2. I have a check coming. I can catch up. Henderson examined his perfectly manicured nails. We've had this conversation before, Davies. The bank doesn't accept promises, and neither do I. You were 2 months behind. I know, sir, and I'm sorry. My daughter, she had an asthma attack. The hospital bills. It wiped me out. I work 2 jobs. I'm trying. Your personal problems are not my business. Henderson cut in. His tone is sharp and cold as glass. I run a business, not a charity. The notice is legal and binding. You have until Friday at noon. Alex leaned forward, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. He could feel the desperation clawing at his throat, a raw, primal fear for his daughter. Please, he begged, the word tearing from him. It's her birthday tomorrow. We have nowhere to go. Just give me until the end of the month. I swear I'll have it all, plus late fees for a moment. A flicker of something unreadable crossed Henderson's face before it hardened back into a mask of indifference. He remembered the scene at the grocery store, the pathetic birthday cake. It wasn't pity he felt. It was disgust. A man who can't afford a $10 cake shouldn't be making promises about $2,000 in back rent, he said, his voice dripping with scorn. Frankly, your inability to manage your finances is becoming a liability. I prefer tenants who are stable. The word hung in the air, an indictment of Alex's entire existence. He was a mechanic's assistant at a greasy garage and a stock boy at a hardware store on weekends. He worked with his hands, his knuckles permanently stained with oil and grime. To a man like Henderson, he was just another piece of failing machinery to be discarded. Alex felt the last of his hope shrivel and die. He rose from the chair, his body feeling impossibly heavy. He looked Henderson in the eye, his own gaze hollow. She's 6 years old, he said softly. Her name is Lily. Henderson simply shrugged, turning his attention to the computer monitor on his desk. Friday, noon, he repeated, dismissing Alex as if he were a servant. Alex walked out of the office and into the harsh sunlight, the landlord's denial of his worth echoing in his ears. He was invisible. His struggle, his love for his daughter, his quiet dignity, none of it mattered. He was just a line item on a ledger, a problem to be erased. He drove home to the little house that was no longer his. The one Lily had filled with crayon drawings of smiling suns and stick-figure families holding hands. On the fridge, a drawing of their house was taped, with the words "Our forever home" scrawled underneath in her clumsy, hopeful script. The lie of it burned a hole straight through his heart. He had failed her. Alex wasn't always this broken. 3 years ago, he had been a man who laughed easily. His world had been painted in the vibrant colors of his wife, Sarah. She was the architect of their joy, a woman whose smile could coax flowers from concrete. She saw the strength in his quiet nature, the steadfast loyalty that ran deeper than words. They had built a life in this small house, a life filled with the scent of Sarah's baking and the sound of Lily's giggles. He worked as a mechanic, a trade learned at his father's knee. His dad, a long-haul trucker with grease-stained hands and a heart of gold, had taught him 2 things: how to rebuild an engine from the ground up, and that you never, ever leave a person stranded on the side of the road. The world's a lonely place, son, his father used to say, wiping his hands on an old rag. A little kindness is the only thing that makes the miles shorter. Then came the rain-slicked night, the screech of tires, and the brutal silence that followed. A drunk driver had crossed the center line, and in an instant, Sarah's vibrant colors were gone, leaving Alex's world in shades of gray. The grief was a physical presence, a suffocating blanket he carried everywhere. But in the middle of that wreckage was Lily, her eyes a mirror of Sarah's, her small hand clutching his. He had made a promise to Sarah in the sterile, whispering quiet of the hospital room, a vow to the fading light in her eyes. I'll take care of her, he choked out. I'll always protect her. That promise became his entire reason for being. He sold his project car, a classic Mustang he and Sarah had planned to restore together, to pay for the funeral. He took on a second job, sacrificing sleep for an extra $100 a week. His life shrank until it contained only 2 things: work and Lily. He read to her every night, his voice a low rumble as he navigated tales of brave knights and magical kingdoms, worlds so different from their own precarious one. He packed her lunch every morning, carefully cutting the crusts off her sandwiches just the way she liked. His quietness, which people like Henderson mistook for weakness, was a shield. It was the armor he wore to hide the gaping wound of his grief, the constant, grinding fear of failing the one person he had left. The asthma attack 2 months ago had been a terrifying reminder of how fragile everything was. The frantic rush to the emergency room, the sight of his tiny daughter struggling for breath, the cascade of medical bills that followed. It was a tidal wave that had swept away their meager savings and pulled them under. Now, drowning in debt and facing eviction, his promise to Sarah felt like a bitter mockery. He wasn't protecting Lily. He was leading her into a world of uncertainty and homelessness, a world without smiling suns or forever homes. The pressure mounted with each ticking second of the clock. Thursday evening, the night before the eviction, was a silent, suffocating affair. The small house seemed to hold its breath, every familiar creak of the floorboards a sad farewell. Alex moved through the rooms like a ghost, placing their few precious belongings into cardboard boxes. Sarah's worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird went in first, followed by Lily's menagerie of stuffed animals, their button eyes staring up at him with mute accusation. Lily, oblivious to the impending doom, tried to help, carefully wrapping her favorite dinosaur, Rexy, in a dish towel before placing him in a box. The community, the small network of neighbors and school parents that should have been a safety net, was a wall of silence. On his street, people saw the orange notice on his door and looked away, their gazes skittering to their manicured lawns or the pavement, anywhere but at him. They didn't want to be involved. Contagious misfortune, perhaps. At school pickup that afternoon, the isolation had been particularly sharp. As Alex waited for Lily, he overheard 2 mothers, impeccably dressed and radiating suburban security, talking near the gate. "It's a shame what's happening to this neighborhood." One of them, Mrs. Gable, said with a sigh, "It feels like there are so many transient families now. It really brings down the property values." Her eyes flickered towards Alex for a fraction of a second. A clear, targeted strike. Alex pretended not to hear, his jaw tightening. Just then, Lily ran out, her backpack bouncing, a bright smile on her face. She hugged his legs, then looked up, her expression suddenly serious. She had heard. "Daddy?" she asked, her small voice piercing his heart. "Are we transient?" He knelt, forcing a smile that felt like cracking plaster. He smoothed her hair, his touch gentle despite the tremor in his hands. "No, sweetie," he said, the lie tasting like poison. "Of course not. We're adventurers. We're just getting ready for our next big adventure." She seemed to accept this, her child's mind turning the terrifying unknown into a game. But as they walked home, holding hands, her question echoed in his mind. The word transient branded him, marking him as temporary, unimportant, disposable. That night, with Lily finally asleep in her bed, surrounded by half-packed boxes, Alex felt the full weight of his solitude. He was an island, and the tide was coming in. He had no family left to call, no friends who weren't struggling just as much as he was. There was no one. He sat at the small kitchen table, the eviction notice spread out before him, and stared at the final, unforgiving deadline. Friday, 12 p.m. He had less than 18 hours to fail his daughter completely. The silence of the house pressed in, a heavy, unyielding force, and for the first time since Sarah died, Alex Davies allowed himself to weep, his shoulders shaking with ragged, soundless sobs. It was almost midnight when Alex left his last shift at the garage, the final paycheck. Not nearly enough. Tucked into his pocket. The drive home was a journey through a personal hell. The rain started as a light drizzle before turning into a torrential downpour, the windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. Each rhythmic slap of the blades on the glass sounded like the word, failure, failure, failure. His mind was a maelstrom of despair. Where would they go? A motel? A shelter? How could he explain this to Lily? The highway was dark and deserted, a slick black ribbon disappearing into the stormy night. His own headlights cut a lonely path through the darkness. Every instinct screamed at him to get home, to crawl into the hollow space that was his life and wait for the end. Then he saw it. Up ahead, on the shoulder, a single headlight sliced through the rain, attached to the hulking silhouette of a motorcycle. Hazard lights flashed weakly, a desperate pulse in the storm. A lone figure, massive even from a distance, was hunched over the engine, rain plastering his long hair and beard to his leather vest. Alex's foot eased off the gas. His father's voice echoed from the past. You never leave a person stranded. But this was different. This was a biker. The vest, the size of the man, it screamed trouble. Alex was broken, exhausted, and had a daughter to think about. He should just keep driving. It was safer. It was easier. He drove past, his gaze fixed on the rearview mirror. He saw the biker kick the engine in frustration, his powerful frame slumping in defeat against the handlebars. A profound sense of desolation emanated from the lone figure, a feeling Alex knew intimately. He saw not a threat, but a reflection of his own helplessness. He couldn't fix his own life, but damn it, he could still fix a machine. With a sigh that shuddered through his entire body, Alex slowed, pulled a U-turn where the median broke, and drove back, pulling up behind the stricken motorcycle. He flicked on his own hazard lights and killed the engine. For a moment, he just sat there, the rain hammering on the roof of his car. Then he took a deep breath, grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight and a small toolkit from his trunk, and stepped out into the storm. The biker turned as he approached, his posture immediately defensive. He was huge, a mountain of a man with a weathered face, a formidable beard, and eyes that were hard and suspicious. The leather vest was adorned with patches, the most prominent of which read, "Hell's Angels." A cold knot of fear tightened in Alex's stomach, but he kept walking. Having some trouble? Alex shouted over the roar of the rain. The biker, whose vest identified him as Grizz, stared at him, his gaze sweeping over Alex's worn-out jeans and thin jacket. "What's it to you?" he growled, his voice a low rumble like shifting gravel. "I'm a mechanic," Alex said simply, shining the flashlight on the engine. Thought maybe I could help. Grizz watched him, silent and wary, as Alex leaned in, the rain soaking him to the bone in seconds. The smell of wet leather, engine oil, and rain filled the air. Alex's trained eyes scanned the engine, tracing wires, checking connections. After a few minutes of methodical inspection, he found it. "Your alternator belt?" Alex said, pointing with a greasy finger. "It's frayed to hell. Looks like it finally snapped." "Yeah, I know that," Grizz grunted. "Doesn't help me much. Tow truck's 2 hours out. If they come at all in this." Alex went back to his car and popped the trunk. He rummaged through a box of spare parts, remnants of old jobs. His fingers closed around a familiar rubber belt. He'd bought it for a customer's old truck, but it turned out to be the wrong size. He'd thrown it in the trunk and forgotten about it. Until now. He walked back to Grizz, holding up the belt. "Might be your lucky day. I think this'll fit for the next hour." Alex worked in the driving rain. He was cold, soaked, and his own world was collapsing, but his focus narrowed to the task at hand. His hands, sure and steady, worked the cold metal, loosening bolts, maneuvering the new belt into place, tightening everything back up. Grizz held the flashlight, his earlier suspicions slowly melting away into a quiet, watchful respect. He saw the skill in Alex's hands, the deep, ingrained knowledge of the machine. He also saw the profound sadness in the man's eyes. Finally, Alex wiped his hands on a rag. "All right," he said, his teeth chattering. "Try her now." Grizz swung a leg over the bike and hit the ignition. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life, a thunderous, beautiful sound that cut through the storm. A slow grin spread across Grizz's face. He revved the engine, a triumphant sound. He turned to Alex, who was shivering, looking small and fragile in the bike's powerful headlight beam. Grizz reached into his leather vest. "How much do I owe you?" Alex just shook his head, backing away. "Nothing," he said. "Just get home safe." Grizz stared at him, holding a thick wad of cash. "Nobody does nothing for nothing, man. My dad always said you never leave a person stranded," Alex replied, his voice barely a whisper over the engine's rumble. "Just pay it forward sometime." He turned and walked back to his car without another word, climbed in, and drove away, leaving the biker sitting there on his resurrected machine, the wad of cash still in his hand, a strange, thoughtful expression on his face. Friday morning dawned gray and oppressive, the sky the color of dirty dishwater. The air in the house was thick with the smell of cardboard and finality. Alex moved in a fog of exhaustion and grief, carrying the last of their boxes to his beat-up sedan. Each trip to the car was a walk of shame, past the windows of his neighbors, who he could feel watching from behind their curtains. Lily was sitting on the front steps, clutching Rexy the dinosaur, her face a mask of confusion and sadness. The adventure was starting to feel scary. The lie was wearing thin. Alex had finally told her they had to leave their forever home, and her quiet tears had been worse than any tantrum. He had just loaded the last box, a collection of photo albums filled with pictures of Sarah, when he heard a soft voice behind him. "Mr. Davies?" He turned. It was Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman from 2 doors down. She was a widow who mostly kept to herself, offering him little more than a curt nod on his way to work. Now, she stood on his lawn, her wrinkled face etched with a hesitant kindness. She held out a large thermos and a small white pastry box. "I saw you packing," she said, her voice soft. "I thought you and your little girl might need some coffee." "And a donut." Alex stared at her, momentarily speechless. It was such a small gesture, but in his world of silent judgment and outright hostility, it felt monumental. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. He took the thermos, its warmth seeping into his cold, trembling hands. "You're a good father, Alex," she added, her eyes surprisingly clear and direct. "Everyone on this street knows it. We just don't always say what we should." She gave him a sad, small smile and retreated back to her house, leaving Alex standing by his car, a hot cup of coffee in one hand and the first crack in his wall of despair in the other. He took a sip. It was hot and sweet, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like hope. But the moment was shattered by the sight of 2 vehicles turning onto his street. The first was Marcus Henderson's gleaming black Mercedes. The second was a county sheriff's patrol car. They parked directly in front of his house. Henderson got out, a triumphant smirk on his face, followed by a grim-faced deputy. It was 11:55 a.m. They were early. The final act of his humiliation was about to begin. Henderson strode onto the lawn, a sheaf of papers in his hand. "Well, Davies," he began, his voice booming with false authority. "Looks like your time is up." Just as the deputy started his slow walk toward the front door, a new sound began. It was a low rumble, distant at first, like far-off thunder. But it grew steadily, getting louder and deeper, a vibration that seemed to travel up from the pavement, through the soles of Alex's shoes, and into his bones. The rumble became a roar, a visceral, ground-shaking thunder that drowned out Henderson's smug pronouncements. Heads turned. Neighbors who had been peeking from behind their curtains now stepped onto their porches, their faces a mixture of curiosity and alarm. One motorcycle, a gleaming black Harley, turned onto the quiet suburban street. It was followed by 2 more, then 5, then 10. They kept coming, a seemingly endless river of chrome, steel, and black leather, until the entire street was filled. They moved with a disciplined, intimidating slowness, their engines a synchronized, deafening chorus. They were Hell's Angels. They formed a semicircle around Alex's small house, their bikes creating an impenetrable wall. They cut their engines in unison, and a sudden, heavy silence fell over the street, broken only by the nervous chirping of a bird. At the very front of the procession on the largest bike was Grizz. He swung his leg over and dismounted, his boots hitting the pavement with a solid thud. He walked towards Alex, his sheer size and presence commanding the space around him. He ignored Henderson and the deputy completely, his eyes fixed only on the tired, bewildered man standing beside a car packed with his life's possessions. Henderson's face had gone from smug to shocked to a pale, sickly white. The sheriff's deputy, a seasoned officer who understood the delicate dynamics of power, instinctively put his hand on his sidearm but made no move to draw it. He stood perfectly still, his face a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes were wide with disbelief. The neighbors were frozen on their lawns and porches, a captive audience to a drama they couldn't possibly comprehend. This was their quiet street of trimmed hedges and HOA rules, now occupied by a force that was raw, untamed, and utterly terrifying. Grizz stopped in front of Alex. He looked at Alex's exhausted face, at Lily hiding behind her father's legs, and then his gaze fell on the orange eviction notice still taped to the front door. He reached out a massive, tattooed hand and ripped it off, crumpling the paper into a tight ball in his fist. He didn't say a word to Alex. He didn't have to. His presence was a statement, a shield, a declaration. A second biker, older, with a graying beard and an air of absolute authority, dismounted and stood beside Grizz. This was the chapter president. He surveyed the scene, the stunned landlord, the cautious deputy, the frightened neighbors, and his gaze settled on the crowd that had gathered. He was about to hold court. The chapter president, whose vest named him Sarge, took a step forward. His voice, when he spoke, was not a shout, but a deep, powerful baritone that carried across the unnatural quiet of the street, compelling everyone to listen. 2 nights ago, he began, his eyes sweeping over the faces of the neighbors. One of my brothers was stranded on Highway 5 in the middle of a storm. Cars flew past. Nobody stopped. Nobody cared. He paused, letting the words sink in. Then one man did. This man, he gestured with a leather-gloved hand toward Alex, who stood frozen, caught in the eye of a storm he didn't understand. This man was soaked to the bone with nothing to gain. He had his own troubles, bigger than any of you can probably imagine. But he stopped. He used his own tools, his own parts, and he got my brother's machine running. He spent over an hour in the freezing rain. Sarge's gaze hardened as he looked from Alex to the community. When my brother tried to pay him, he refused. He said, "Just get home safe." He asked for nothing. He expected nothing. He just helped a stranger. A murmur went through the crowd of onlookers. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly widow, nodded slowly, a look of vindication on her face. Mrs. Gable, the parent from the schoolyard, had the decency to look ashamed. "We have a code," Sarge continued, his voice resonating with conviction. "We take care of our own. And when someone shows our family that kind of honor, they become our family. So when we found out that the man who saved our brother was being thrown out of his home, well, we consider that a family matter." Grizz stepped forward, turning his attention to the crowd. His voice was rougher than Sarge's, more personal. "We looked into him," Grizz rumbled, his eyes finding Alex's. "We learned about his wife. We learned he works 2 jobs to keep a roof over his little girl's head. We learned about the hospital bills that put him in this hole. This man works harder in a day than some of you do in a month, and he gets treated like garbage." He then turned his massive frame to face Henderson directly. The landlord flinched as if struck. "And we learned about you," Grizz said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "We learned how you publicly humiliated him at the grocery store over a birthday cake for his daughter." A collective gasp went through the neighbors. The story, now laid bare for all to see, was uglier than they had imagined. The bikers weren't just here because of a broken-down motorcycle. They were here because they had seen a quiet man's dignity being systematically dismantled, and they had chosen to intervene. The truth of Alex's struggle, his private pain and quiet resilience, was no longer his secret to bear alone. It was now public record, announced to the world by the most fearsome and loyal messengers imaginable. The sheriff's deputy slowly lowered his hand from his weapon, a look of dawning understanding and respect on his face. This wasn't a threat. It was a reckoning. The bikers did not just stand as silent sentinels. At a nod from Sarge, they moved with the quiet efficiency of a military unit. Several large, unmarked panel trucks that had parked at the end of the street rumbled to life and pulled up behind the wall of motorcycles. The rear doors opened, and the bikers began to unload them. It was a reverse eviction. They carried in a brand-new, stainless steel refrigerator, moving past the stunned landlord as if he were a ghost. They brought in a new sofa to replace the threadbare one Alex owned, a solid oak dining table, and a small, sturdy bed frame for Lily's room. Box after box of groceries, canned goods, fresh produce, and meat were carried into the small house, filling the pantry and cupboards that had been nearly bare. One of the bikers, a man with the word Sparks on his vest, was an electrician. He immediately got to work fixing the faulty wiring in the kitchen that Henderson had ignored for months. Another, a contractor with a tool belt already strapped on, climbed a ladder to inspect the leaky section of the roof that had stained the ceiling in Lily's bedroom. The community watched, mesmerized and humbled. This was not charity. It was a restoration. It was a powerful, undeniable statement that this man, this family, belonged here. Grizz walked over to the pale, trembling Henderson. He wasn't menacing. He was calm, his movements deliberate. He held up a thick, white envelope. "This is 12 months' rent," Grizz said, his voice flat and final. "In cash. You will write a receipt, and you will not bother this family again. Are we clear?" Henderson, utterly defeated, could only nod, his eyes wide with fear. He took the envelope with a shaking hand. Grizz then turned back to Alex. He was holding something small in his other hand. It was a child-sized leather vest perfectly made. On the back, there was no club insignia, only a single, beautifully embroidered patch. A deep red rose, its petals rendered in exquisite detail. "For the little one," Grizz said, his gruff voice softening as he looked down at Lily, who was peeking out from behind Alex's leg. "My wife made it. The rose, we heard her mom's name was Sarah. This is for her." Alex's eyes filled with tears. He knelt and helped Lily put on the tiny vest. To fit her perfectly. She looked down at the soft leather, then ran a small finger over the rose patch, a look of solemn wonder on her face. The sheriff's deputy finally moved. He walked over to Henderson, took the eviction papers from his limp hand, and tore them cleanly in half. "Seems to me the rent is paid," the deputy said, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face. "You should probably be on your way, Mr. Henderson." As Henderson scurried back to his Mercedes, a sound started from the assembled neighbors. It began with Mrs. Peterson, the elderly widow, who started clapping, her soft, rhythmic applause cutting through the silence. Then another neighbor joined in, and another, until the entire street was filled with a wave of thunderous, heartfelt applause. It was for Alex. It was for the bikers. It was for the simple, profound act of justice they had all just witnessed. The rest of the day unfolded like a strange, beautiful dream. The intimidating wall of motorcycles transformed into the backdrop for an impromptu neighborhood block party. One of the bikers rolled a massive grill out of a truck, and soon the air, once thick with tension, was filled with the savory smell of barbecue. The bikers, who had seemed so menacing just an hour before, were now laughing, sharing food, and talking with the very neighbors who had feared them. They were husbands, fathers, and veterans, their intimidating exteriors housing a fierce and gentle loyalty. Grizz, the fearsome biker who had been stranded on the highway, spent most of the afternoon with Lily. He lifted her onto the seat of his massive Harley, her small hands gripping the handlebars, her face alight with pure joy. She wore her new leather vest with a proud seriousness, the embroidered rose a silent tribute to the mother she barely remembered. The other bikers treated her like a tiny, precious queen, bringing her sodas and telling her stories that made her giggle. Alex stood on the porch of his home. His home, he realized with a surge of relief that was so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He watched the scene unfolding on his front lawn, a quiet, genuine smile gracing his lips for the first time in years. The crushing weight that had been sitting on his chest for so long had finally lifted, replaced by a warmth that spread through his entire body. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer transient. He was seen. He was protected. Mrs. Peterson brought him a plate of food, her eyes kind. "We're sorry, Alex," she said softly. "We should have been better neighbors." Alex just shook his head. "Today is a good day," he said, and it was the truest thing he had ever said. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the street, a signal passed between the bikers. The party began to wind down. They cleaned up with the same efficiency they had shown earlier, leaving the lawn cleaner than they had found it. One by one, they approached Alex, shaking his hand or clapping him on the shoulder. Sarge was the last one to speak to him. "You ever need anything," he said, his gaze steady and serious. "And I mean anything you call us. This is a standing offer. Your family now." With that, they mounted their bikes. The quiet street was once again filled with the roar of engines, but this time, the sound was different. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. It was a declaration of allegiance, a salute to the quiet man on the porch. They rode off in a long, thundering procession, their taillights disappearing into the twilight. Alex stood there with Lily, her small hand in his, and watched them go. The house behind them was no longer a place of despair, but a sanctuary, filled with food and new furniture and the lingering spirit of an unexpected brotherhood. The street was quiet again, but it was a changed quiet, filled with the resonance of respect and the promise of community. The rumble of the engines faded into the distance, but for Alex Davies and his daughter, the feeling of safety, of dignity, of belonging would last forever.